gentlemen, I'd now like to welcome to the podium Mr. Martin Wolf, Chief Economic Commentator from the Financial Times. Thanks very much.
So good afternoon. I'm wearing my card because the nameplate down there said Michael Wolf, and I didn't want to be confused with the gentleman who wrote those fascinating books on the Trump administration. So what I'm going to do now is actually strangely follows almost perfectly from what you were just discussing, which is about political and other risks. But it's going to be very broad. It's not going to talk about financial centres or their future, which I have many views and prejudices, but are probably not helpful here. I'm going to talk about what I see as the global context, but it is a very abbreviated version of a much larger lecture, so there are an immense number of important points I'd like to cover but won't be able to do so. I hope it will take about 20 minutes, and in which case maybe there's time for a question or two. So I'm going to talk about fragility and what that might mean for the future. And before I start, I'd just like to say what I mean by fragility. I think it has been obvious to many of us since 2007, and perhaps if we'd been smarter, it would have been obvious earlier. I wrote a lot about some of these issues in the early 2000s after the Asian financial crisis, that we've been moving into a world which has been changed so much and in so unpredictable a way from the point of view of billions of people, that its politics and so also its economics have become fundamentally fragile. And what I mean by fragile is a world in which, quote marks, anything can happen. Which doesn't mean, strictly speaking, that anything can happen, but a lot of things you don't think are reasonable and normal can happen. That is a world in which the fundamental assumptions about how it works, how great powers operate in it, what they think their interests are, how they relate to the economy, how the politics of their countries works, how the values of their countries work, how relative power works. All these are in question. And in such a world, as I said, anything can happen. And so I'm going to discuss a little bit of the fragility. And I'm going to start with this quote. Sorry, it's 2016. I keep on forgetting to change that. Of course, it's 2016. So this is a very remarkable statement. Wouldn't be particularly remarkable if it were Abraham Lincoln, interestingly enough, who was, of course, a very serious protectionist. Apart from that, the similarities between him and Donald Trump are small, but it's one in which they were very similar. But from the 1930s, starting with the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, the US has taken the view that open markets work. They're in the interests of the US and they're in the interests of the world. And that was the single most important reason we've ended up where we are. Pretty obvious. US power, US domination, and US ideas. And Donald Trump was telling you, that's all over. We don't believe in any of that. Rather brutally. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength for us. What happens to you guys? Your problem. So that was a pretty major moment. And there was a big discussion, you might remember, about whether you should take Mr. Trump seriously or literally. I always took the view that you should do both. And in the case of trade policy, that's clearly the case. Today, or very soon, the average tariff level in the US, admittedly focused very much on a few partners and above all China, the average tariff rate level across all its imports will be the same as Brazil's. It's completely outside the norm for developed countries since about the 1970s. So this is a different world. What that means, well, who knows? And by the way, this is one of the few points on which Mr. Trump, though in a slightly different angles and for slightly different reasons, agrees completely with the Democrats or the other way around. This is not partisan, it's bipartisan. As is the attitude to China, by the way, again, for somewhat different reasons. But I know lots of Democrats and quite a few Republicans, probably more Democrats, and they all basically think China is a menace. So this is a different world. So, I'm going to talk about fragility, and then I'm going to talk about what this might mean for the future. So I'll start with this chart. It's one of my favourite charts, and I think it will help you, or maybe not. Anyway, what it shows is the growth rate of the world economy as a whole. It's at PPP because it's the only data we have, and there are some problems with it, but it's the best we have. And it shows all the significant recessions since 1900. And there are several points that emerge from this which are really very, very interesting. The first is we've done a much, much better job in that period that I talked about, the period of US hegemony, in stabilizing the world economy than they did before the Second World War. And so that's the first thing. You know, managed markets or managed economies has worked rather well. We haven't had a single negative year for world GDP since the Second World War. That's incredible. And if you'd ask somebody in 1945 how likely that was over the succeeding 70 years, it's inconceivable. They were worried about the Depression next year, demobilization. The second thing to note is what has caused really big downturn, really big shocks. I don't have the time to go into long-term trends of productivity, just don't have the time. So the answer is actually only three things. There are three things that have really messed up the world economy over this 120 years. And they're not very surprising things. They are world wars, not a good idea. You're talking about political risk, you didn't mention that. Why didn't you mention it? Do you think it's inconceivable? Of course it isn't. Okay, world wars, really big financial crises. The three we have here are the Great Depression, the Asian financial crisis, and of course the Great Recession, which is number 8. You can see that very, very clearly. It's the worst recession since the war. And wars in the Middle East that lead to a complete mess up of the global oil supply. Do you think that's unlikely? If so, where have you been hiding recently? Okay, so those are the things you might worry about if you're worried about what might go really bang in the night, or bump in the night. And that's important. So let's talk about some of the fragility things that you have to worry about. Well, the first is that by historical standards, we have a stupendous amount of debt around in the world. And we have more debt around in the world relative to world GDP, this is all economies, than we did 10, 12 years ago during the crisis. Its composition has shifted a little with more government and more non-financial corporate sector and less household and less financial sector debt. But the aggregate level has risen. In the developed countries, it's basically stabilised. I'll come to one aspect of this in a short while. The basic point, which you all know, but is very, very important, is the way we decided to deal with the crisis is stabilise the debt stock. And the way we not reduce it, but try to discourage it from growing, and that had big implications for growth, by the way, very big. We didn't really want a debt explosion, so we throttled the financial sector, quite deliberately. We didn't say so, but that's what we did. But we tried to make it stable without a cumulative mountain of defaults. And we did this by doing this. I won't have all the other charts. I've got oodles of charts on interest rates, blah, 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 blah. But this is just the one I ended up with, and it's the chart of central bank intervention rates since 2006, and it tells you what you know. The crisis came, and the central bank decided to go into free money mode. I didn't talk about long-term debt, but it's essentially the same. Long-term bond, I'll come to one aspect of those in a second. If you think this is rather a peculiar chart, and you look at the European side, which is very, very clear right at the bottom, and the tiny rise in the UK, which isn't going to last very long, I promise you, particularly if we have a no-deal Brexit. I'd like to point out that the Japanese have been essentially there since 1994. So 25 years of zero rates. And their main problem is they can't get enough inflation 25 years later. So how long do you think the ECB will be at zero? My guess is another 20 years. I could be wrong. But anyway, that's where we are now. The US is particularly interesting because the US Fed thought they got such a strong recovery that they could get rates to normal levels, or at least reasonably normal levels. And they want them because they think, I don't say whether I think it, that they need about 5 percentage points of room to deal with a serious recession. And so they really don't want to be anywhere down that. The others have had to give up because they have no chance of getting there under current circumstances or policies. So they worked very, very hard and almost got to 3, which is nowhere near far enough, and they've given up. That's quite interesting. Is that the ceiling in this cycle? I have no idea, but it could be. And that worries them a great deal, because they really, really don't know what they'll do if they're hit by a serious recession. And by the way, neither does any of the other central bankers. There are things they could do, there are things I would advise them to do, but they really don't want to do them because it would require serious cooperation with the fiscal authorities. And in case you hadn't noticed, the fiscal authorities are not easy to cooperate with anywhere. So that's how we handled the debt. And we did something else in the process of this. We created a really incredible quantity of negative yielding debt. So most recently about $16 trillion. There was a brief decline in it, it's now $16 trillion. So you're paying the governments to lend to them. Some of us think it's rather difficult to understand why governments aren't going out and borrowing like mad if the markets are prepared to pay them to borrow. But my view is the governments consist of cretins, and that's been very complimentary. And that's what I think will happen in the next recession, by the way. I think the governments will forget all this. Boris is already forgetting all this. Trump has pretty well forgotten all this. And the last holdouts are the Germans, and they're going to forget all about this. And so what we're going to do in the next cycle is monstrous increases in government debt. You can't imagine how big they will be. Okay, all fragility. Now then there's the fascinating case of China. There is an enormous amount to be said about China, an economy I've been following pretty closely since 2003. Anyone who wants these charts, welcome to have them. I've got lots more. So this is very interesting because it's very significant about the way the world economy has been working. So what happened in 2008 to China? Well, the answer is very simple. Its debt started to explode. Why did it start to explode in 2008? Because our debt stopped growing. It's what I call the law of conservation of debt bubbles. That is to say, it's been very clear for about 30 years that in order to keep the world economy motoring nicely, somebody has to be doing a serious debt bubble. It was the Asians in general in the late 90s, developing countries in the 70s. I won't go through the whole history. Then we got to the big one, us. And when we stopped, China suddenly found its 10% of GDP current account surplus, which is the way it balanced its economy and absorbed its excess savings, didn't work anymore because export markets had just disappeared. I remember discussing this with the Chinese at that very time. I was invited by a very dear friend to give a paper at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which was to say, essentially, the debt model, the export model you've had is completely kaput, over, done. And they realized this very, very quickly, and this is the result. They decide, okay, we need a huge investment boom. We've already got the highest investment rate in the history of the world. Now let's get really serious, get to 50% of GDP. How are we going to do that? We're going to fund more property investment than you could possibly imagine, and that's what happened. And they don't like the results, but that's where they are. Does that make China fragile? Yes, but in a very complicated way, which I don't have time to go into. Okay, globalization is stopping. It hasn't reversed, but it is stopping. Very important source of fragility. And these are April forecasts from the IMF, and probably optimistic. So these are three-year moving averages of growth of GDP, red column, and trade, purple line, just to differentiate them. And you'll see something really rather important. Until the financial crisis, trade in the world, this is goods trade. No, sorry, it's goods and services trade together. The volume was growing twice as fast as world GDP, roughly. That was the globalization era. Since then, it's been growing at the same rate, but is slowing sharply in the most recent year and will almost certainly now invert. Not dramatically, this isn't the early 30s, we're not in Smoot-Hawley territory, but that's the tendency of where we're going. As Mark Carney says, whatever else Brexit is, it's a deglobalization event. A small one, compared with what the US is doing, but significant. So, I think we should assume that over the next 20, 30 years, plausibly, globalization will go somewhat into reverse. Not necessarily, but it's very likely. How badly? That's a very good question. And then, of course, we need to focus on the big story in trade policy, which is the US-China trade war. And this is very, very interesting. I'll make one comment about the US strategy, and then I will talk about this chart and what it tells you. There's a fundamental problem with US trade strategy vis-a-vis China. I go into this for vast lengths. I've written lots of columns about it, and trade has been a subject close to my heart since I worked in the World Bank in the 70s, and I even wrote a book about it. So the problem is the US is basically caught between two views of what it wants China to do. And these reflect profound internal tensions in the US. And the Chinese, being really quite smart, know there is this conflict, and that makes it impossible for them to resolve it. What are the two views? The first view is everything will be fine when China's economy works just like ours. Free markets, intellectual property protected like ours, all the rest of it. So the program is to make you just like us. And that is ostensibly the negotiating brief of Mr. Lighthizer. But there's another agenda, which is actually, we don't want you to be just like us. We want to be just like you. I.e., we want to manage our markets, close up our vulnerability to trade, particularly with you, and for national security reasons and economic security reasons, we want to decouple completely. We don't want to have anything to do with you. Go away to Mars or somewhere like that. I'm not being entirely facetious. Because of these two different objectives, and Mr. Trump, by the way, has an objective all of his own, which may or may not love, which is what I'm going to come to in a second, the Chinese don't know how to resolve this dispute, and it won't be resolved. It's the one consistent position I've taken, on which I've been proved happily correct so far. It will not be resolved. This will only get worse. There might be little blips when the stock market goes down and the election gets close, but this will get worse. And it will get worse if Elizabeth Warren is president. It's not just about Trump. Now, Mr. Trump's obsession is the bilateral trade deficit. He thinks whenever you have a bilateral trade deficit with anyone, the anyone is cheating you, by definition. He has never understood fully what markets are, let alone what trade is. He is impressively stupid, but that's not important. He is the President of the United States, and he believes you've got to get rid of the bilateral deficit. So this is the balance looked at from the Chinese side. It's quite interesting. The red shows the bilateral trade deficit as a share of Chinese GDP. The lighter purple, the dark blue line is exports from the US to China. It's the bottom, and the purple line is exports from China to the US. So first, China has a large bilateral surplus as a share of GDP. Second, after they decided to get rid of their current account surplus, it fell dramatically. So at the time when the US needed to go for it was 2005, not 2015. Pretty obviously, China's dependence on the US has shrunk dramatically over that period, from about 10% of GDP bilateral surplus to a little under 4%. What's happened since the US went for punishing China's exports to the US? Well, it's very interesting. They have reduced the bilateral surplus a little as a share of Chinese GDP, but remarkably little, given all the noise and so forth. And they have certainly reduced US exports to China. I would say, if I were Mr. Trump looking at those figures, I would say, given how hard I've hit them, I'm not doing very well. Which means, if you're Mr. Trump, you have to do more of it. The final source of fragility, since I thought I'd mention geopolitics, and I will lose fairly soon, I'm not doing very well on time, is China is becoming a serious strategic rival. And the Americans look at this in strategic terms. You can probably meet lots of Americans who are in the financial sector or in business. They are not the decisive players in this anymore. The decisive players in this are the strategic thinkers and security thinkers. And they think China is a serious enemy. The serious enemy. The enemy they've all been waiting for. What's the security system want? It wants enemies. That's what they're for. That's what Eisenhower famously warned in 1950, or 1958, sorry, in his farewell speech, I think, about the military-industrial complex. So this shows the shares of different countries in military spending as a share of world GDP, world military spending, sorry. The US is dominant, it's the dark blue, it's still dominant. Its allies are the lighter blue, Europeans and others. So the developed countries, and its allies, if they're still allies, are still dominant. But look what's happened to China, which is the dark red. And imagine what that's going to look like 20 years from now. Well, imagine above all what the American strategic system thinks it's going to look like 20 years from now. Well, you know what they think it's going to look like, and they don't like it. Okay, future, very briefly. I'll just cover 2020 in a summary. So, because this little picture tells you a lot about where we are right now. So these, what I tend to do with consensus forecasts, since I never believe forecasts, is just look at how they're evolving. So these are the consensus forecasts for January and September for the developed world. And you see two really very important things. One, the US is the fastest growing significant developed country. It has been for a long time and will almost certainly continue to be so. So within the developed world, the US is becoming more important. Because it's got a better economy, chums, and more people. The demography is more favourable. The second is, of course, Japan and Italy are absolutely miserable for essentially demographic reasons, and all the other countries, above all the Eurozone and the UK, are suffering huge growth forecast reductions. Not the US. Fiscal policy works if you do enough of it, though Trump is getting worried and is trying to take over the Fed. Everywhere else, the growth slowdown is dramatic. By the way, just remember, these growth rates are all in the 1 to 2% range. Well, except 0 to 2%. Okay, this is the rest of the world. And the really important thing is the first three columns. China, India, the Asia-Pacific as a whole, excluding Japan. These are not PPE numbers, they're real money numbers. And basically Asia is growing 2.5 times as fast as the developed world. It's been growing 2.5 times as fast as the developed world for the last 25 years roughly, and it's almost certainly going to go on doing so. We're on the wrong side of history. We don't like it, or at least they don't like it in Washington. I think we don't like it here either. That's why we have this Brexit nonsense. The other developing countries that are relatively large, Russia, Brazil, Mexico, are really going nowhere. The whole story of growth in the world economy is Asia. Everything else is footnotes. Since they contain rather more than half, these countries in the first three, more than half the world's population, it's pretty obvious what's going to happen. Futures. Okay, last two slides, and I have done my 30 minutes, and I'm exhausted time anyway. What are the three probabilities you can imagine for the future? One, bet on Asia, and then bet on Asia. Relatively. They're not doing as well absolutely, but they're going to do better relatively. And secondly, the US is going to become progressively more important in the developed world, and increasingly will go on to increase its contempt for the Europeans and the Japanese. Maybe justified, maybe not justified, but that's what they feel. In aggregate economy, in economic performance and innovation. Geopolitical fragility. We have a sustained rise of populist nationalism. I don't have enough time to explain why. I've written a whole book about it. I'm writing a whole book about it. But anyway, my view is it's going to get worse. It's not going to go away, it's going to get worse. Second, the West has ceased to exist as a functioning system, and that won't change when Trump goes. It's not even clear it fully worked with Obama. We're now really in the post-Cold War period, when America basically says, Europe, yeah, just a problem. Third, US-China friction is going to get worse. It's got a tremendous dynamic behind it. There's a tremendous momentum in it, and by now, all confidence and trust in one another has gone. The Chinese are very, 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 very angry. They're just polite and don't tell us. They tell it themselves in Chinese. The no-deal Brexit is what's going to happen. I thought this for a year and a half, and it's going to be a fantastic mess here, and it's not going to help the EU either. But the EU has some, and I say this with great regret, gigantic internal problems which are going to be very, very difficult to handle. I always agree with Mario Draghi, who I think is a great man and has saved Europe temporarily, but his confidence that he's fixed the euro strikes me as very slightly over the top. The Middle East is a real powder room now, with the US and Saudi Arabia and Israel on one side and Iran on the other, and I don't know what's going to happen, but it looks terrifying. And of course, we've forgotten all about mega-terrorism, but it's still out there. It's a big risk, as my friend Graham Allison has pointed out. And finally, geoeconomics. The trade wars will get worse. There will be greater China-US decoupling. There is a risk of a big oil price spike. I read that the Saudi Crown Prince forecasts that risk. But even if it's him, and I wouldn't trust him on anything else, I suspect he might well be right. Certainly if the Iranians up the ante on what they just did a few weeks ago, it'll be a mess. Secular stagnation, low productivity growth, low interest rates, and all the rest of it are, I think, almost certain in the West. There's a severe, real risk of another deep recession, simply because these things cannot happen, and there are so many shocks that could cause them. And if we do, the real problem is not we'll have a recession. Recessions are normal, or in significant slowdowns are normal. It's just we don't know what to do about them. There's a low risk, but an incredibly dangerous risk that what we'll actually get is not just deep recession in a deflationary environment, but deep recession in an inflationary environment. I think that's rather unlikely, but there are some things that could happen. We could have underestimated significantly the possibility of wage explosions in the current world, because we have very low unemployment in some very important economies, and that might give us stagflation, and that really would be a nightmare, because they'd have to raise rates, and then what would happen to all that debt? Real rates go up or can go up in stagflationary periods, depends on the inflation rate. There's a risk of another financial crisis, because there's all that debt out there. I tend to think it's a low risk, but it's there, and there's always the possibility of an unknown. So I hope I've done enough to persuade you that it is a fragile world and to position yourselves accordingly. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you have now, after that very interesting presentation, you have 10 minutes. You must be back in at 4:10 when we will resume the session. You can have a quick cup of coffee now, but please be back here by 4:10.